wishing you a wonderful day today. If you're a business owner, you've probably heard some version of this tension before. Entrepreneurs are supposed to chase profit, but Buddhists aren't supposed to be greedy. So how exactly are we meant to reconcile the two? I want you to really sit with this question today, because I think most people who ask it are actually working from a mistaken idea of what the Buddha taught in the first place. Here is the real mistake. A lot of people assume the Buddha discouraged his followers from becoming wealthy. The truth is closer to the opposite. He actually encouraged it, and in several places gave very specific, practical guidance on how to do it well. The confusion mostly comes from a misunderstanding of who the Buddha actually was. Many people picture him as some kind of deity, a godlike figure who grants wishes if you show up, bow deeply enough, and ask for favors. But the historical Buddha was a real person, with a wife, a child, and real material wealth, who lived much like the rest of us, including plenty of worldly pleasure, before he eventually left all of that behind to search for a way out of suffering, and found it. There's a second mistake that often comes bundled with the first, the idea that being a genuine Buddhist means living an ascetic, self-denying life, constantly suffering, constantly depriving yourself. That is also wrong. What the Buddha actually taught was a middle way, staying clear of excessive indulgence in pleasure, but equally staying clear of extreme self-punishment that destroys this precious body. Most of this confusion comes from never having read the earliest layer of teachings, the Nikaya texts, which preserve the Buddha's own words far more directly than many of the later, more devotional texts repeated daily in temples, texts asking for rebirth in a pure land, texts asking a bodhisattva to rescue you from suffering, texts asking a healing Buddha to cure your illness. Those texts absolutely have their place, but they were never meant to be the entirety of what Buddhism teaches about how to actually live. Here's the thing that took me a long time to understand properly. The Buddha gave an enormous number of teachings, and he tailored each one to a specific audience. A teaching aimed at someone gravely ill is completely different from a teaching aimed at a business owner. A teaching for a teacher differs from a teaching for a farmer. A teaching for a butcher differs from a teaching for a student. Think of it like a doctor prescribing medication. What you give a patient with a heart condition is completely different from what you give a patient with a stomach condition. If you take medicine prescribed for liver cancer and give it to a patient with a completely different condition, it obviously won't help, and it might genuinely make things worse. In exactly the same way, the Buddha gave real teachings specifically about earning money, spending money, dividing up assets, leadership, vision, and management. Teachings clearly meant for people running businesses. If you are an entrepreneur, these are the teachings worth actually searching for, rather than the devotional texts meant for people nearing the end of their life. Reading the wrong texts without understanding this distinction can genuinely leave you feeling discouraged or pessimistic, quietly convincing yourself of things that aren't true or helpful at all. Reading without this understanding is, in a sense, not the approach of someone using wisdom, and Buddhism is fundamentally a path meant for people willing to think clearly. So why do some people work incredibly hard and still never become wealthy? The Buddha addressed this too. Long ago, he specifically warned lay practitioners against certain occupations that damage a person's own merit, occupations that might make you rich quickly, but only let you enjoy that wealth briefly, while quietly destroying an entire lifetime, leaving you to experience ongoing suffering as a result. Everyone wants to be wealthy, but wealth that doesn't create wrongdoing is genuinely good, while wealth that piles up more and more wrongdoing behind it isn't worth wanting at all. Whether you end up wealthy or poor comes from your own past actions and their results, not from some deity handing out fortune arbitrarily. If a god really could just grant wealth on a whim, that god would be deeply unfair, favoring the rich while condemning the poor to suffering. Wealth and poverty are something each of us genuinely creates for ourselves through different kinds of merit we accumulate. There's a teaching in the Anguttara Nikaya that illustrates this well. The Buddha was staying near Kosambi in Gosita's park when the Venerable Sariputta came to him and asked, "By what cause, by what condition, do some people fail in business no matter what they try, while others succeed exactly as they hoped, and others still succeed beyond anything they even hoped for?" The Buddha explained it this way. Someone who approaches a monk, promises to help, and then fails to give what they promised. After that person's life ends, wherever they are reborn, whatever business they attempt will fail, never reaching what they hoped for. Someone who approaches a monk, promises to help, and actually gives exactly what they promised. After that person's life ends, wherever they are reborn, whatever business they attempt will succeed exactly as they hoped. And someone who approaches a monk, promises to help, and then gives even more than they promised. After that person's life ends, wherever they are reborn, whatever business they attempt will succeed beyond anything they had even hoped for. What this teaching shows us is that getting rich isn't simply about knowing how to earn money. It's also about accumulating merit through offerings, generosity, and genuinely good actions, so that wealth, once earned, actually lasts. There are plenty of people who become extraordinarily wealthy, yet because they are stingy and never practice generosity, their fortune quietly slips away over time, often bringing down both their finances and their family's happiness right along with it. In business, which people often call a battlefield, the truly foolish ones, when they fail, simply blame bad timing or bad luck. But the people who genuinely succeed didn't necessarily start with more capital or more talent or more connections than everyone else. What actually matters is the root and foundation of merit they had already planted, both in the past and in the present. To put that story simply, someone who approaches a monk, promises help, and doesn't follow through ends up failing in business after being reborn, no matter what they attempt. Someone who promises and delivers exactly what they promised succeeds exactly as they hoped. And someone who promises and then gives even more than promised succeeds beyond their own expectations. So who's to say the Buddha never taught people how to get rich, or never explained the actual causes behind building wealth? I've studied this quite carefully and applied it well over many years myself. Earning money and building wealth the way the Buddha taught doesn't just help you personally, it genuinely helps everyone around you as well. The people who benefit from your wealth should ultimately include yourself, and also the wider society, not just materially, but spiritually too. I've always kept this simple in my own mind. You can only give others what you actually have. You can't give someone something you don't possess. If you want to help someone poor, you need money. If you want to teach and share knowledge, you need actual understanding and experience. If you want to bring others joy and happiness, you have to be happy yourself first. Earning money in order to help the poor is exactly the kind of wealth building the Buddha taught, and it brings joy not only to you, but to countless others as well. If you have money and use it to help those in need and those who are struggling, everyone benefits. Your own family, your relatives, your neighbors, your entire community, all of them share in that happiness. Now, if you want lasting, sustainable success in business, there are things the Buddha explicitly taught to avoid. These teachings appear clearly in the Anguttara Nikaya, describing 5 kinds of business a practitioner should stay away from, sometimes called unethical trades. Don't trade in weapons. Don't trade in human beings. Don't trade in meat from animals raised specifically to be slaughtered. Don't trade in alcohol or intoxicants. And don't trade in poison. If you genuinely want lasting wealth and lasting happiness, it's essential to avoid doing business in these 5 categories. A person with real wisdom holds right view, and right view means clearly knowing what is right and what is wrong. Once you clearly know right from wrong, there's no good reason to keep doing something forbidden. It's a bit like knowing a particular liquid is poison. Someone with real sense simply never drinks it. If someone knows something is wrong, harmful, or forbidden, and still deliberately does it anyway, that comes from a lack of wisdom, from delusion. We shouldn't necessarily blame the person directly. The real fault lies in the delusion filling their body and mind. People who deliberately trade in goods that harm others, that's what genuine greed looks like. Excessive greed, blind greed, greed clouded entirely by delusion. I've read this teaching very carefully and applied it well for many years myself. There's also a teaching on the 5 legitimate reasons for building wealth. Let's look at another passage. Once, the Buddha was staying near Savatthi, in the park belonging to a certain wealthy and generous businessman everyone in the community knew well, called Anathapindika. Anathapindika came to pay his respects to the Buddha and sat down beside him. The Buddha told this businessman, there are 5 reasons to build wealth. First, wealth earned through diligent effort, gathered by the strength of one's own hands, earned through honest sweat and lawful means, brings comfort and joy to oneself, and also brings comfort and joy to one's parents, spouse, children, employees, and workers. Second, a student of the Buddha who earns wealth through diligent effort brings comfort and joy to friends and companions as well. Third, a student of the Buddha who earns wealth through diligent effort finds that disasters which might otherwise leave a person penniless are held at bay, and that person's wealth stays genuinely secure. Fourth, a student of the Buddha who earns wealth through diligent effort can use it to make offerings to relatives, to guests, to the deceased, to the king, and to celestial beings. And fifth, a student of the Buddha who earns wealth through diligent effort can offer support to renunciate teachers and to Brahmins, and this highest form of giving leads to boundless merit, both in the human realm and in the heavenly realms. So there it is, clear proof that the Buddha absolutely did guide people on how to build wealth, and explained the legitimate reasons for doing so, both for his direct students and for business people more broadly. Earning money and building wealth the way the Buddha taught doesn't just help the person doing it, it genuinely helps countless other people too, both materially and spiritually. There's a businessman worth remembering here whose real name was Anathapindika, one of the wealthiest people of his entire era. This same figure is honored in most temples across the north, positioned right next to the 2 guardian deities in nearly every temple, honored under the very down-to-earth title, roughly translating to Lord of the House. On the other side sits Ananda, the Buddha's foremost disciple in terms of memory, who also served as his personal attendant for decades and who remembered nearly everything the Buddha ever taught, which was eventually passed down orally and finally written into scripture. Without Ananda, we simply wouldn't have the Buddhist scriptures we have today. Anathapindika himself was extraordinarily wealthy and famously covered an entire plot of land with gold coins just to purchase the grounds of Jeta's Grove, where he then built a monastery and offered it to the Buddha and his students. This same site later became the setting for many of the most important teachings in the entire canon. Every year, during the 3-month rains retreat, Anathapindika personally provided all the food, drink, and other necessities for the entire monastic community, which numbered as many as 1,250 students. Without someone as wealthy and capable as Anathapindika, who exactly would have supported the Buddha and such a large community through the rainy season? So how could anyone possibly claim the Buddha discouraged wealth? He simply advised against building wealth through dishonest means. And if you actually read the scriptures, you'll notice that so many of them begin with the same phrase, "Thus have I heard." The Blessed One was residing in the city of Savatthi, in the park belonging to Anathapindika, in Prince Jeta's Grove, describing countless days, months, and years the Buddha spent right there. Without a wealthy businessman like Anathapindika donating that grove and providing for the community's needs, would we even have these teachings to study today? In my view, what the Buddha never encouraged was boundless, selfish, blind greed, like a bottomless pit that never shares or helps anyone else. What he actually encouraged was earning money and then using it to help others through generosity and genuine offerings. I've always found real teachings from the Buddha specifically addressed to lay practitioners, people just like you and me, living ordinary lives with families and regular jobs, meant to be read, understood, and actually applied. So, if this video gave you something valuable today, please check out the full Buddhism in English channel for more videos to help you find peace and wisdom through ancient teachings. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching.